This is Chapter 26 of the American Pageant, the Great West, and the Agricultural Revolution, 1865 to 1896. Let's get started. All right, on to some key points. First of all, the federal government incentivizes and encourages westward expansion, including railroads, land, irrigation projects, and as the pageant says, in no other region has the federal government played a larger role in the economic and social development. Also, individual farmers in the frontier struggle, as do miners as well. And agriculture will consolidate and follow a similar pattern as other industries, and a political movement will emerge out of the struggle of farmers. I wanted to show you this map again so you can get in your mind the idea that native peoples who lived in the frontier region were numerous. There was distinct groups that had emerged that had a variety of geographic and cultural influences to make them distinct, but they all were competing for similar resources, at least on the Great Plains here. We're talking about folks who are following the bison. And so there's a lot of movement and conflict and clash that actually occurred before white settlers and soldiers encroached upon those lands. All right, so natives on the plains were nomadic peoples, and so that in itself is radically different from what Westerners, Europeans, and Americans, how they sort of structure their livelihood. And these people are following the bison, so they rely on it extensively for a variety of things. I'll show you a diagram of that in just a second here. And similar to what we saw in Key Concept 1 earlier in the year, as U.S. soldiers and settlers do move west and encroach upon native lands, they bring with them disease, which of course will decimate native populations. All right, kind of a throwback slide here to Key Concept 1, talking about native peoples and the introduction of the horse from the Spanish and a byproduct of that Columbian exchange, and how it transformed the methods used for hunting bison. And here's a little diagram showing the various things that were made from bison, including tools and clothing, as well as shelter, and obviously meat and fuel as well. But in 1900, at least, you can see the extent of American Indian reservations. And the two largest reservations named in the first section of our book here would be the Great Sioux Reservation in Dakota Territory and the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. But you can clearly see that those reservations are quite small. And so we're going to see the movement of native peoples west and then the consolidation of native peoples onto these confined areas. There are major differences in terms of social structure between native peoples and non-native peoples as well, and this also further complicated and in fact increased this culture clash between the two groups. So in the United States, at least I think we still consider the family to be the basic unit of society, but ultimately we're all bound together by the state government, the town government, and the federal government that we, follow. And so for us in our world, that is completely normal. Now, native peoples didn't organize themselves that way. They had sort of a family structure where, perhaps an elder within that family is going to be the person in charge, or perhaps there are several families that have banded together in sort of a small-scale tribe that have allegiance to one another. But this concept of large tribes and chiefs which reign over large tribes, as the pageant tells us, is somewhat fictitious. Unfortunately, the federal government didn't seem to understand that, and they attempted to pacify the Plains Indians, through legal means, through treaties such as Fort Laramie in 1851 and Fort Atkinson in 1853. And ultimately, this marks the beginning of the reservation system in the West. All right, so there's a disregard for human life that occurs throughout the Indian Wars, and oftentimes these battles are, in fact, massacres. So there's a few examples from our textbook here. The Sand Creek Massacre, where Colonel Chivington's men killed 400 Native Americans, many of which were women and children. 1866, we have a Sioux War party that killed Captain William J. Fetterman's men in Wyoming. And then the story you may have heard of prior to this class, the Battle of Little Bighorn, or as it's sometimes called, Wright Custer's Last Stand, in which Colonel Custer and his 7th Cavalry were basically slaughtered by a Sioux party in 1876. So, one thing I want to say is that both sides did commit these atrocities, yes. But the other thing is that it's more than just military conquest we're talking about. There's other factors involved, including modern technology such as the railroad, as well as disease, which you've already mentioned, and alcohol, another factor which decimated native peoples. All right, so in 1865, it's estimated there was 15 million bison. 1885, less than 1,000 left. And where did they go? Well, it seems as though Americans figured out that in order to remove a people who are dependent upon an animal, you just need to remove that animal. And so bison were being slaughtered for their tongues and hides. they're also being shot for amusement. Now, I don't necessarily think in 2018 we look back at this and say this was hunting for sport, but it became sort of a luxurious activity to do for the well-to-do to hop on a train, head to the west, see the countryside, and shoot bison. Now, I try to impress upon my students that we should not project our values and beliefs backwards, and I know that I just did that in the previous slide, so I'll try to avoid that again. But I think from our modern point of view, we have a hard time being okay with the treatment of Native Americans. It just doesn't work for us. It's important to point out that in the 1880s, at least Helen Hunt Jackson, in her A Century of Dishonor, was voicing that sort of modern opinion and exposing the true nature of government treatment of Native Americans. Similarly, we could look at assimilation or forcing American culture upon natives and say, well, that's just not right. The idea of killing the Indian to save the man just doesn't make any sense to me. But I do think that those who advocated for assimilation were, in their own day at least, they were social reformers. And before we get on to assimilation more, let's talk about the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887, which now treated natives as individuals. They did not recognize tribes in a legal status or a legal sense. Instead, it gave individual Indians, heads of family now, 160 free acres of land, very similar to the Homestead Act. But this Dawes Act remained the basis of the government's official Indian policy until the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and it sort of ushers in this whole new era of treating natives. So as I think we've discussed already this year quite a bit, the general consensus in the 19th century was still that native peoples were savages. They were uncivilized or they were primitive, and to some extent people viewed them as less than human. But those that cooperated, those that it was believed they might be able to be saved, those that perhaps embraced assimilation for one reason or another, may have been referred to as a noble savage, as opposed to the ignoble savages which resisted any kind of encroachment, whether it was onto land or cultural encroachment for that. But again, we're talking about adults here. By 1879, the federal government realized that assimilation could be carried out through children, the next generation. And so the Indian boarding schools were used as a way to remove children from their native influences, take them out of their homes, take them away from their families, and instead place them into a boarding school in which, as Richard Pratt had said, one could kill the Indian to save the man. And so you'll see these schools pop up where young native people are transformed. Their clothing, their hair is transformed, their language is transformed, their daily structure is transformed, all of which resembles this sort of modern American culture of the 19th century. It doesn't look all that different from school today, to be honest with you. Also, these schools were used as a way to demonstrate, how far natives could progress. And so while I think we refer to people who advocated for these schools as social reformers, there is sort of a trophy kind of mentality here of, look at the Carlisle Indian School, which beat Harvard. And I apologize, I can't really see the year. I think it says 1911 on that football. But they beat Harvard, a school that was known for not just for being a school of football, but for an established university, a predominant university in this country. In the center row, by the way, just to the right of the man with the football, is Jim Thorpe, who many consider to be one of, if not the greatest American athlete ever. All right, so several discoveries of gold and silver did encourage people in large groups to head west, hopefully to strike rich. And so you can see here the 59ers and the Pikes Peakers went out to the Rockies after gold was discovered there in 1858. In 1859, the Comstock Lode was discovered, and that also encouraged people to head west. Like this gentleman here, perhaps, sitting by the stream or the riverbank all day long with this very simple piece of technology, the pan, hoping to strike it rich. Unfortunately for him, many others, that was not the case. Even using technology such as this sluice here, which this crew could use to sift through more dirt and hopefully find more gold, just didn't turn out the way they had hoped. In fact, an incredibly small percentage of people who went west in order to find gold actually got rich. Most of them had to find something else to do. Much like mining and industry in the East, consolidated capital drove the small-time individual gold miner out of business very quickly, as the majority of the gold was located far under the surface and required tools and machinery to access. I'm all set with going that far underground, unless, of course, it's that cave where the DeLorean was hidden. Then I might check that out. The influx of miners, though, did lead to the growth of towns, the rapid growth of towns. You can see here Deadwood, South Dakota, 1876, in roughly 15 years. 1890, it has changed significantly. One thing I like to talk about in my classes is sort of how industries are related and how they follow similar patterns. And so we could look at the development of the railroad in the late 19th century and see how it impacted the cattle industry as well. So obviously, longhorn cattle are located in Texas and that part of the country, and they have to make it to market. And so cowboys will bring those cattle up these trails on the long drive to railheads in places like Abilene, Kansas, and from there they can be shipped back east alive, and therefore they could be slaughtered back east, and the meat would be, well, it wouldn't spoil, I guess is a better thing to say. Later on, these industries do begin to organize. That's the Wyoming Stockholders Association you see here, which will make the cattle raising business profitable. But the industry itself does begin with this iconic mythical cowboy, and for a period of roughly 30 years or so, folks did actually drive cattle as we like to remember them doing. Obviously, this is somewhat of a misleading image, though, because these cowboys here, well, that's only one part of the population. They're African Americans, there were Mexican cowboys, such as this vaquero you can see here, who probably taught the other cowboys a lot of the techniques, a lot of the language, and brought to them a lot of the tools and so forth that were used for this. Here are those trails you can see, many of them that end on these rail lines here. And really, it was drought and barbed wire, which actually sort of cut short this period of cowboys, right? Barbed wire kind of enclosed the open range, and the drought killed off quite a few cattle. And so the cattle industry turns to big business or consolidated business, as other industries had done as well. So of all the groups, I kind of feel for the farmers because I have an idea at least of the kind of work that goes into farming, and as I understand it, it's just never ending. And maybe the Homestead Act in 1862 encouraged you to uproot yourself and walk on out or take the railroad out to Iowa and start yourself up a farm. But unfortunately for the folks who did go out there, many of them failed, and as a result of that, they were forced to give that land back to the government. So I suppose they're out $30 they're going to have to find something else to do. They did look for new methods. The land that they did acquire was quite dry, as I'm sure you know. They did use methods such as dry farming, especially west of the 100th meridian, but over time that depleted and dried the soil as well. They did adopt new strains of wheat, for example. I believe it was a Russian strain of wheat. It's quite hardy and it could survive in these sort of harsh and extreme conditions. But again, farmers just typically struggled, even though there were federally financed irrigation projects, which did lead to success for some. In general, the Great Plains were a difficult place for many to succeed. So despite the hardships that people endured in the West, the population grew significantly. In fact, in the 1870s and 1890s, you can see that several new states were created, and this includes Oklahoma in the 20th century, the Sooner State, Boomer Sooner. But just look at this map here, and excluding the deep blue that you see with Alaska and Hawaii, just looking at the continental United States, the next two deepest shades of blue, it's a sizable portion of the country that's been organized in the last part of the 19th century. And so by 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau claims that there is no more discernible frontier lines. This is an important turning point for the United States. Basically, the frontier is gone, and also in that same year, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurs, which is the last armed, organized Native American resistance against the United States. And so that's also an important turning point. At the same time, you have to understand that Western cities were growing and developing. As many farmers and miners failed, they looked for work elsewhere, and they found that in cities. Also, some unhappy Easterners moved west, but not as many as we might think. And by 1880, the area from the Rockies to the Pacific coast was the most urbanized region in America. So high prices will drive farmers to specialize. Wheat and corn, for example, become a single cash crop. Farmers will grow a tremendous amount of that. They'll sell the majority of that. They'll use the proceeds from that to buy goods that they would have previously made for themselves. That makes sense to me. There is this sort of real push for modernization, as you can see here, mechanization of farms, and it is the genesis of this sort of agro business today. And new inventions, including the twine binder and the combine, will turn farms into outdoor grain factories. Here's an ad for a twine binder. I think it was 1804 I saw. Now, unfortunately for farmers, this one-crop economy, much like it was for the South, is going to be kind of a roller coaster, so to say. Their livelihood is dependent upon the price of that same he skyrocketed. And as a result of that, the inverse relation, right, prices of that corn, well, it decreased pretty significantly. So obviously farmers are pretty unhappy about this. They've already been dealing with problems that we've discussed already with the soil, the drought, the unprotected world market, and the fact that they have to purchase their manufactured goods in this tariff-protected home market. But in addition to that, something we talked about a few chapters ago, government in general favored business, right? It was a laissez-faire approach in general to the economy, and therefore the idea was that there should be no regulation, that sort of stronger components of the economy will, well, they should thrive, and weaker ones, I suppose, should not. But obviously, that's not something that farmers are going to necessarily support, especially when they begin to fail. So, what is a farmer to do? All right, so in 1867, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry was founded by Oliver H. Kelly, and their purpose was to advocate for farmers. They're the oldest advocacy group for the agricultural interest in the United States. They had a lot of secret rituals. In fact, they met in secret. Some of their rituals resembled Freemasonry. I just read online, which is kind of interesting. But they do begin to lobby state legislatures, and they advocate for things like cooperative grain elevators and warehouses. Many of these Granger laws will be overturned by the federal government. Obviously, the idea of public control of private business is a bit radical for a time that advocated and, in fact, stood behind laissez-faire economics. Another group, the Greenback Labor Party, did sympathize with farmers, and they also advocated for inflation, making money more available to debtors so they could pay back their debt, avoid foreclosure, and ruin. Here is Oliver Kelly. All right, now another group that emerged was the Farmers Alliance in the 1870s. This began as sort of a social outlet for folks living in these rural, remote areas to come together and kind of share their experiences and help one another. But quickly they began to cooperate as they realized that they were all kind of dealing with the same problems. And they tried to break the strangling grip of the railroads and manufacturers through cooperative buying and selling, as the pageant says it. The alliance had limited power, however, because they excluded black farmers and landless tenant farmers. And as a result of that, a Colored Farmers National Alliance was formed in the 1880s to attract African American farmers. This ultimately does lead to the Populist Party. Now, we already talked about the Populist Party in a previous chapter, but just to review, this is a brief summary of the Omaha platform, which we did read in class. But the People's Party, as they also were known, saw themselves as a voice for the people. And now we're talking about farmers again, right, obviously. But keep in mind there's this widening gap between the rich and the poor, and the agricultural interest starts to feel like, well, they're not even being heard. In fact, they're kind of being cast aside. Now, they do advocate for some radical things in their own day, including nationalized industry and a graduated income tax. They also proposed a new federal sub-treasury, which would provide farmers with a loan of sorts and hold those crops until prices rose. And of course, they wanted free and unlimited coinage of silver. Now, many of these things do, in fact, become enacted later on and are adopted by the other major two parties. So the panic in 1893 and the depression that follows does help strengthen the populist stance, and you would think that it would actually build a pretty strong bond between industrial labor in cities and farmers on the frontier and so forth. Just look at unemployment here in 1894, 1896, it's above 9%. That's quite significant. And as a result of that, Jacob Coetzee does go to Washington to really protest for a public works program, a method or a strategy that's going to be used in the 20th century to combat economic depression. There's also the labor leader, Eugene Debs, and he's the head of the American Railway Union. He helps to organize the Pullman strike of 1894. Pullman workers had their wages cut, and the rents in those company towns were not, and so this is a large strike. Unfortunately for those workers, President Cleveland did send in troops, federal troops, to break that up. And so obviously you can see here that in 1896, government typically just sides with business over labor and agriculture. And the Republican Party will run William McKinley, and he is an advocate for laissez-faire economics. He supports the trickle-down effect, which again says that those atop the socioeconomic ladder should be able to keep more of their money, which of course they will then invest and create more opportunities for the rest of us. The Republicans also support the gold standard, again backing money with gold only, a more stable currency. Now the Democrats Democrats will eventually support here William Jennings Bryan. And we're going to talk about him in a second, but he does advocate for inflation, for the unlimited coinage of silver. And as a result of that, he has the support of many populists. All right, so more on Bryan and the idea of bimetallism, or free silver, or unlimited coinage of silver, all the same thing, all mean the same thing, which is going to be more money or inflation. Now, the 1896 Democratic National Convention, Bryan does deliver this cross of gold speech. This is a big deal, and in this he advocates for a percolate up approach rather than a trickle down approach. Again, foreshadowing some ideas that we see in the modern world, and in fact in the 20th century as well. Let's put money into the hands of people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who need it most, need it more immediately, and allow it to find its way to the top. Now, within his speech, he makes this very memorable quote here, one that you probably should know. And he says that you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Obviously referencing the crucifixion here. He also references the Revolutionary War, and he is well received by his supporters. There's a lot of folks in attendance, by the way. You can see, I see James Buchanan's picture up on the wall. I see Andrew Jackson. Is that Franklin Pierce? I see over there as well. But the crowd is very large, and while critics do criticize Bryan for sort of referring to himself or seeing himself as a demagogue, if you want to say it that way, he is widely appreciated for this and does receive, obviously, the Democratic nomination for president. All right, so McKinley wins the election in 1896. He has a lot of support in the East. Bryan's support came from the debt-stricken South and the Trans-Mississippi West. Again, those who really needed more money, those who advocated for inflation, which was the heart of Bryan's campaign. It seems as though urban laborers, they sided more with the industrial interest than with the agricultural interest. And in fact, from here on out, the focus of elections will be on the urban vote as opposed to the rural vote. Now, 1896 and 1932 is going to be known as the fourth party system, and issues such as civil service reform begin to fade, and new issues, including industrial regulation and the welfare of labor, do emerge. All right, so we are 60% of the way through the American pageant. You know that Republicans want to raise the tariff, right? And that's what they do in 1897 with the Dingley tariff, to generate revenue. Republicans also will take credit for the prosperity which follows the Panic of 1893, and the Gold Standard Act of 1900 will allow for paper currency to be redeemed in gold. Okay, that is it for today in Chapter 26. I thank you very much for watching. If you have